Inflation disproportionately affects low-income families, exacerbating financial inequality and making it harder for them to meet basic needs. While rising prices impact everyone, the consequences are more severe for those with limited financial resources. Low-income households typically spend a larger share of their income on essentials like food, housing, and transportation, all of which are often the first to see significant price increases. With fewer savings, limited flexibility in their spending, and wages that often don't keep pace with inflation, these families are more vulnerable to the erosion of purchasing power. As a result, they face greater challenges in maintaining their standard of living, leading to tough trade-offs and long-term economic hardship. Number 7. Higher proportion of income spent on necessities. Low-income households typically allocate a much higher percentage of their income toward basic necessities, such as food, housing, transportation, and energy, compared to higher-income families. These are essential expenses that cannot be easily reduced or avoided. During periods of inflation, the prices of these core goods and services tend to rise more rapidly than other discretionary items. For example, when food prices increase, which is common during inflationary periods, the impact on a low-income family's budget is especially harsh because they are already spending a larger share of their income on groceries. As a result, the higher food costs take up a disproportionately large chunk of their available funds. This leaves less money for other necessary expenses, such as healthcare, transportation, or education, forcing families to make difficult decisions. They might cut back on healthy food choices, delay medical care, or reduce spending on transportation, all of which can further degrade their quality of life. Unlike wealthier households that can absorb these price increases by using savings or investing in inflation-protected assets, low-income families often have little financial cushion, which makes them more vulnerable to the negative effects of inflation. This imbalance significantly increases financial stress, exacerbating existing inequalities. Number 6. Limited financial flexibility. Low-income families often have little financial flexibility and minimal savings, which makes them particularly vulnerable during periods of inflation. When prices rise, especially for essentials like food, housing, and transportation, these families struggle to adjust their budgets because they don't have the cushion of savings or investments to rely on. Higher-income households, in contrast, can often absorb price increases more easily by tapping into their savings, selling investments, or cutting back on discretionary spending like entertainment, travel, or luxury goods. This allows them to maintain their standard of living despite inflation. However, low-income families already living paycheck to paycheck don't have the same luxury. Their spending is already heavily concentrated on necessities, and they often have little room to cut back further. Without savings, they cannot fall back on emergency funds to weather the impact of rising costs. This lack of financial security makes it much harder for low-income families to absorb the shock of inflation, forcing them to make difficult trade-offs, like going without healthcare or education or taking on debt just to make ends meet. The lack of financial flexibility not only deepens their immediate hardship, but can also have long-term consequences, potentially trapping them in a cycle of poverty. Number 5. Greater vulnerability to price volatility. Low-income families are particularly vulnerable to price changes, especially for essential goods and services like rent, utilities, and transportation, which often don't have easy substitutes. Unlike discretionary items such as dining out or entertainment, these necessities are non-negotiable. When inflation drives up the cost of housing, for example, a significant portion of the family's income is quickly consumed, leaving less room in their budget for other basic needs. The same holds true for energy bills, water, or transportation costs, which are essential for daily life, but can rise sharply during periods of inflation. As a result, low-income households may be forced to make painful trade-offs to keep up with the rising cost of living. They might reduce their spending on food, opting for cheaper, less nutritious options, or delay needed healthcare or medical treatments due to higher costs. These tough decisions can lead to deteriorating health, poor nutrition, and a lower quality of life, all of which further perpetuate financial instability. For families already living paycheck to paycheck, such inflation-driven pressures can have a lasting impact, making it harder to break free from cycles of poverty. Number 4. Less access to inflation-resistant assets. Wealthier families typically have the financial resources to invest in assets that can protect them from the effects of inflation, such as real estate, stocks, or inflation-protected bonds. These investments often appreciate in value or generate returns that outpace inflation, helping to preserve or even increase their purchasing power over time. For instance, owning property can provide a hedge against rising housing costs, while stocks and bonds can offer returns that keep up with or exceed inflation rates. On the other hand, low-income families generally lack the capital to invest in such assets. With limited savings, they are unable to take advantage of these inflation-resistant opportunities. As a result, low-income households are more exposed to the erosion of purchasing power caused by inflation, as their income may not keep up with rising prices and they are unable to benefit from the wealth-building opportunities that inflation hedging investments provide. This financial disparity further exacerbates inequality as wealthier families' assets grow in value while low-income families struggle to maintain their standard of living. Number 3. Wages may not keep pace with inflation. There are many instances in which salaries for workers with low incomes do not increase at the same rate as inflation. This means that even when they do receive pay raises, these boosts are sometimes insufficient to keep up with the quickly increasing costs of living. For example, if the rate of inflation is 5%, but the salary rise for a worker is just 2%, then the worker's real income, which is adjusted for inflation, actually declines. Due to the fact that the worker's real income is decreasing, their purchasing power is decreasing as well. This is because they are unable to afford as much goods with the same amount of money. Because of the increased expenses associated with essential commodities such as food, rent, and transportation, a bigger proportion of their wage is consumed by these expenses, leaving less money for savings or discretionary expenditure. Individuals with higher incomes may see their pay grow in accordance with inflation or even receive raises that outperform it. On the other hand, individuals with lower incomes are more likely to experience that their wages remain stagnant, which makes their financial situation even more difficult. The disparity between salaries and inflation makes it significantly more difficult for people with low incomes to keep their standard of living at the same level, let alone increase their financial stability. Number 2. Substitute goods are less accessible. While middle and high-income families have the flexibility to adjust their spending when prices rise, such as by opting for cheaper cuts of meat, switching to store brands, or purchasing in bulk, low-income families often lack this option due to both time constraints and limited resources. For example, wealthier households might have the ability to shop around for the best deals, plan meals in advance, or purchase higher quantities of discounted items, all of which can help mitigate the impact of price hikes. On the other hand, low-income families are often constrained by factors like long working hours, limited access to affordable transportation, and a lack of savings to take advantage of bulk purchasing. Additionally, they are often already purchasing the most affordable options available, meaning there's little room left to cut back further without compromising on quality or nutrition. As a result, when prices for everyday goods like food, gas, or utilities rise, low-income families are forced to bear the full brunt of these increases without the ability to substitute for less expensive alternatives, further straining their financial well-being. Number 1. Public assistance programs may not fully offset inflation. For individuals and families relying on public assistance programs like food stamps, SNAP, or housing subsidies, inflation often leads to a mismatch between the benefits they receive and the rising cost of living. These programs are typically adjusted on a set schedule or at a slower pace, which means that when inflation drives up prices for essentials like groceries, rent, or utilities, the assistance may not increase fast enough to keep up with the higher costs. As a result, recipients find their purchasing power eroded. What once covered their basic needs may no longer stretch far enough to meet those needs. For instance, SNAP benefits may not fully reflect the sharp increases in food prices, or housing subsidies may fall behind in covering the rising cost of rent. This gap forces low-income families to make difficult choices, such as cutting back on food or other necessities, leaving them further vulnerable to economic hardship. Thanks for watching and subscribing channel.